And last week we did a Mishpat Maimer from Tafshin Yutes. Vayiru es Elokei Yisrael v'tachas raglov k'maisa livnas asapir u'che'etzam hashamayim lo toyer. And the reason we did this Maimer from Tafshin Yutes because it's going back from the beginning of the Nesias. It's the earliest Mishpatim we have not yet done. And when we have extra weeks, like the Chaparayin, and do extra Maimarim, and this is the extra Maimer that we did. But the next Maimer from Lamed Vav is Eresh Vayakhel. Shabbos Nevarchim Ad Sheni. Vayakhel is a couple of weeks away. We have Truma, Tetzava, Kitisa, and the Roch Vayakhel. We're holding Eresh Shabbos Kiddush Pashas Truma. So I'm not sure yet what my Maamar makeup will do in the next couple of weeks. Perhaps next week I'll already do Vayakhel and I'll worry after that. Maybe I'll do a couple extra Purim. But today we're learning a Maimer from Vayakhel, Tafshin Yutes, 1959. I did think a little bit about doing other things. I settled on this. It's a little bit untimely because Vayakhel is a few weeks away, and if I wanted to do a Vayakhel, maybe I should have done Lamed Vav first. But this is the decision that I made. Be'ezer Hashem Yisbarach v'Yisala. So Zeh Hachiloinu. It's Pashas Truma, and we're doing a Maimer Vayakhel, and there's a Gavaldik Hashgacha Pratis in that as well, because this Maimer does a lot with the Kir, V'sisa Kir Necheshes, V'kane Necheshes Nerachza, V'yas as a Kir Necheshes, V'kane Necheshes, Mimares Hatzei V'teshoy Yisrael Pesach Hayel Moyed. So I guess in some way there's a connection between our Pasha, Pashas Truma, and the Teichen of this Maimer, which is a Siyas Akir. Okay, enough introduction, enough excuse giving. Let's go. We're going to learn the Maimer now. If you went to the page and you downloaded our Maimer, you see that our Maimer is more than 8 amudim long. It's 9 pages. It's 8.5, 9 pages long, which is long for us. L'cha'eda, we can't finish it in one sitting. It should take 2 classes. And I guess I wouldn't consider this Maimer a particularly hard Maimer. It's an interesting Maimer. I wouldn't consider this Maimer a particularly hard Maimer. The Maimer is about the Kir, about the water basin, which was made from copper. And the water basin sat on a leg, on a support, on a stool, which is called the Kan of the Kir, with a chof, that was also made of copper. But this Maimer doesn't explain the water basin in halacha. Doesn't at all go into the direction that we have so often about the inyan of the Tzivis Hashem, the Mesiras Nefesh that Jewish women had to bring Jewish children into the world, and therefore they use these mirrors, etc., etc., etc. This Maimer explains the Kir and the copper mirrors entirely al pi Chassidus and al pi Kabbalah. It's interesting. The whole Maimer is going to explain the Kir and the copper mirror is entirely al pi Kabbalah and al pi Chassidus. It's all spiritual. The nekuda of this Maimer, in other words, the most important thing I would need to say to give direction to this Maimer, the nekuda of this Maimer is that the Mara Tzatzevis, and the word Mara we translate it as a mirror, but Mara actually means a utensil for seeing, a looking glass. And there are different levels of utensils for seeing. That's what's called Aspakladia Ha'meira, Aspakladia She'eina Meira. Our Maimer is going to talk about both. And the Maimer is going to argue that any time you want to see something and you use a tool, that tool compromises your vision. In other words, you would see it better without the need for a tool. But on the other hand, when a person cannot see directly, and they're therefore in need of a tool to help them see, when they see indirectly, what's called in Chassidus Eir Chayzer, they often come to see things that they would never be able to see if they were looking at it directly. And that's the nekud of this Maimer, that the kir is made from a mare, from a tool that assists in vision. And tools that assist in vision are necessary because we cannot see directly, so we have to see indirectly. And this itself, there's 2 levels of Aspakladi Ha'meira and Aspakladi She'eina Meira, but on both of those levels, on either of those levels, particularly on the level of Aspakladi She'eina Meira, the lower level, when you see something indirectly, which shows on a deficiency, it shows on a flaw, it shows on a chasar that you're not able to see directly, you have an advantage, because when you see indirectly, you see things that you wouldn't see otherwise. That's the nekud of the Maamar. That's the thrust of the Maamar. It's connected to the Kiyah, it's connected to the Beis Hamikdash, it's connected to the Achei Temimim, all kinds of other wonderful, delicious things. That's the nekud of the Maamar. However, the Maamar has a haschol and a siyum that's different. Meaning to say this, if you ever studied the Maamarim of the Rebbe from the first 10, 12, 13 years or so, you see that Vayakhel, the Rebbe, has a habit of, quote, chazeding Maamarim from the earlier Rebbe. That's what he's doing. He's taking Maamarim from the earlier generations and he's reviewing them. Naturally, he doesn't repeat them verbatim. He says them Vayakhel in his own signet, the Rebbe's own form. And the Rebbe's form is shorter and crisper and clearer, and frequently with novelty, frequently with chiddush. But the Rebbe also has a habit of saying a Maamar from one source and taking the beginning and end from someplace else. Meaning to say, the Maamar is 80%, in this case it's probably 85%, 90% from one Maamar. And if you look in footnote 14, you see it's based on Vayosam Asakir, Reish Nandalid, and Ateres, and Reish Lamed Beis, which is Maamarim from the Rebbe Rashab and the Rebbe Marash. But the very beginning and the very end, there's a different Maamar, Vayakhel. And they don't really tell us what the source is, but this is a classic Vayakhel shtickle. And it's a very, very small piece of the Maamar which is connected to Vayakhel. Now, if you're looking at this Maamar on a deeper level, meaning looking at this Maamar on a very pneumistic level, you would have to say that the ikir of the Maamar is the Aschol and the Siyum. Because the name of the Maamar, the Rebbe always says, Shmei Yashayikale B'Lashon HaKedesh is Vayakhel Moish, which means that the whole Maamar is about the idea of Vayakhel. When in reality, a tiny percentage of the Maamar talks about Vayakhel. So what we're going to do now is we're going to first learn Vayakhel. I'm going to learn the first paragraph of the Maamar, then I'm literally going to go to the very, very last 5, 6 lines of the Maamar. And we're going to learn the Vayakhel shtickle first, beginning and end. And then we'll delve into what amounts to the body of the Maamar, which is the idea of the Kiyah. And you'll see how the Rebbe introduces us to the Kiyah. The Rebbe introduces us to the Kiyah by first introducing us to Gan Eden and asking us a kasha and giving a teretz and explaining the need for levushim. And then the manos hatzeves are going to be levushim atu madreges, as I mentioned, ukafishi is ba'alakam and ba'arucha. So we're going to start with Vayakhel. But before I start to read the Maamar, I just want to repeat one more time what I said. The Maamar is going to discuss the Kiyah, and that the Kiyah was made from mares. Mares is translated as mirrors, but it more correctly means tools of vision, looking glasses, looking mediums. And of course the argument is you need a tool to see when you can't see directly. So you need a tool. And the argument is that when you see directly, you see deeper and better than when you need a tool. And you only use a tool because for some reason your eyes are failing you, so you need to have a tool. Whereas the Rebbe is going to explain in this Maamar, if your eyes would see directly, it would burn. It would be too strong. So you use a tool to diminish the light so you should be able to see something. So accordingly, seeing through a matter, seeing through a tool, seeing through a looking glass would be a diminution, would be a chesaron, would be a lack when compared to seeing directly. So the Rebbe says that's true on the one hand. But in the area of Oir Chayzer, that because you're not seeing directly and you're seeing indirectly, you're coming to see things that you would never be able to see, that you're only seeing them because it's indirect. And of course, the Nimshal is, the Eibishter makes darkness in the world. And you need to deal with the darkness, and you need to overcome the darkness, and you need to correct the darkness, and you need to reverse the darkness. And when you do all of those things, you overcome the darkness, you deal with the darkness, and you correct the darkness, and you transform the darkness, you reach a light which would not be available if the darkness had not been there. And now let's learn the beginning and the end of the Maamar. Vayakhel Moshe is called as Bnei Yisrael. Moshe collects the entire community of sons of Israel. When he talks to all of them collectively, these are the things, these are the words that HaKadosh Baruch Hu told us to do. Now, of course, we all know that every single time Moshe Rabbeinu spoke, he spoke to the whole collective, he spoke to all the Yidden. Like Rashi says in Parshat Kisi, says, this is the Seder of Torah, that first Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to Aaron, and to Avihu, and to Lazavi, Sama, and to Ayin Zkenim. And then he spoke to all the Jewish people. So there was always a Vayakhel when Moshe Rabbeinu taught Torah, like it says in the Chassidus, in Parshat Ba'aleischa, that Moshe Rabbeinu would gather the Jewish people to teach them Torah, but it doesn't always say Vayakhel. Here it says Vayakhel, that he collected them, that he made a point of collecting them. And of course, if you wanted to be a nitpicker, and you would be very right to pick this nit, you would say that Vayakhel sounds like Hakel, and Hakel doesn't only mean you gather the people who are able to learn, you gather Anoshim, Noshim, Etaf, like Har Sinai. It's called Hakel, right? In Chumash, it's called Yom HaKohol, when the entire community was collected, and even children and Amaratzim and Yedim who didn't speak Lashon HaKodesh, V'chuli, as the Rambam describes it in the third perek of Hilchas Chagiga. Everybody is collected for this occasion, and he gives them the mitzvah of Melechas HaMishkan. However, he doesn't give it to them directly. Hine, when you read in this pasuk, these are the words, the things that Hashem commanded. So you have to assume that it means the thing that Hashem is telling all the Jewish people together about building the Beis HaMikdash, because all the Jewish people need to participate in the Beis HaMikdash. But before he mentions the Beis HaMikdash, he warns them about Shabbos, before he tells them about building the Beis HaMikdash. That even though building the Beis HaMikdash is such an important thing, before you start to build it, you have to know some things that are even more important than that. That's the Yin Shabbos. And of course, you find the same thing in Parshat Kitisa. That's when the Eibush just talk about building the Beis HaMikdash. He also warns them, V'shamar b'nei Yisrael es Shabbos. And of course, in Pneumistic terms, if the Beis HaMikdash represents Dir B'Tachteinim and Bidurim, Shabbos represents Tainug and Aliyah and Dveikus and Hafshata from this world. And Shabbos is not moved because of this kavanah of building the Beis HaMikdash and then bringing karbonis and doing tshuva and so on and so forth. Shabbos is not nidche. And because we're talking about building the Beis HaMikdash, we're only mentioning Shabbos to give context that whatever the building the Beis HaMikdash involves, and whatever the Beis HaMikdash, building the Beis HaMikdash means, it's not Deiche Shabbos, but he's talking about building the Beis HaMikdash. Hutzrach Hazak calls, that's B'nai Yisrael has become necessary to collect the entire nation of Israel. And the reason is, Ki HaMishkan Winyan Klali, because the Mishkan is an idea that's called Klal. It's a basic idea. It's encompassing all of Yiddishkeit, and therefore Shayeches L'Klal Yisrael, it touches the collective Jew. And perhaps you could say that in a way it's even more than Shabbos, although it's kind of hard not to consider Shabbos an Inyan Klali. Shabbos is an Inyan Klali that happens Bizman Prati. And Mishkan has to do with the whole Kavanah Sabriya. Shara Inyan Mishkan, who the point of building the Beis HaMikdash is that Hashem wants to have a home in this world, and he wants it. There was in the beginning, when the world was perfect. That when the Eibush made the world, and the world was perfect, and Klipa was Betachtas Asiyah, Ikir Shechina Betachtainim Hoyted, the level of Shechina called Ikir, was in this world and built, and the Beis HaMikdash is bringing back Ikir Shechina, that should also be Betachtainim. And the beginning of that process is a small building, a small house, relatively speaking, that, so to speak, houses the Shechina and the Kedusha, which rests on top of the Shechina, and for this you have to collect all Yidden, because it's negayah to all the Jewish people. So the Rebbe said you have to mention Shabbos, but we're focused not so much on Shabbos, we're focused on building the Beis HaMikdash, and for this you have to be makel all the Jewish people. There's no question, there's just a statement that when it comes to building the Beis HaMikdash, you have to collect all the Jewish people. Now go to the last page, the last Chassidus Mamish. Where the number 3 is on page 80. I took this from the Teres Menachem. I don't have the Maimorim, I just have the Sforim, the Siches. I took it from there, and I'm sorry about the page numbers. Vayakhel Meish is called as B'nai Yisrael. Meish Rabbeinu collects the entire collective of Jewish people. The Rebbe told us in the beginning that because the Mishkan is an Inyan Kloli, it requires Klolos Yisrael. So Meish Rabbeinu collects all the Jewish people. So now that we learned the Maimah, the Rebbe said Vayakhel doesn't only mean the Jewish people. It means to collect every aspect within each Jew, both the faculties of the Jewish people, the midas, the koiches of the Jewish people, the midas, what's called yadayim, as you'll see in the Maimah, and halavushim, the machshava dibur amaisa. First of all, the garment of thought, speech, and action, which you'll see in the Maimah, is called raglayim. The inner faculties, which is called yadayim. And the Vayakhel doesn't only mean you're collecting people, Vayakhel means you're collecting avodas. You're collecting aspects of avodas Hashem. Or to say it in a more involved way, you're collecting all of the inyonim that are birudim, sparks, that are released and revealed and uplifted and included in Elikus, because you overcome hardships. Because you overcome hardships in avodas Hashem and you bring them to Elikus, and that's included in the Vayakhel. So in the beginning of the Maamar, Vayakhel meant to gather all the Jews because it's negate to all the Jews. And at the end of the Maamar, it means gather all the Jews and all of their inyonim, all of their avodas, including the avodas that are represented by the kir, which is basically the avodas of overcoming obstacles. The one who was able to collect and gather, not just all the Jewish people physically, but all the aspects of avodah, all the nitzutei gedusha and birudim, or the chayzer, if you will, that the Jewish people are doing, requires Dafka Moshe Rabbeinu. And Moshe Rabbeinu is bechinas ma umadema. He's a lakus, and a lakus in its purest level. If you remember the Maamar that we learned last week, which was the Maamar of Vayiru Salakei Yisrael V'tachas Rakol Kamas Livnas Asaper Chetzim Shmaim Lotoyer. And the Rebbe said there's madema, there's a lakus, sheba lakus, atzilus, sheba atzilus. Moshe Rabbeinu represents this level. And days of Efshalias, and only when Moshe Rabbeinu was involved. And you collect every Jew, and you collect every spark, which every Jew elevates. Efshalias, Amshachas, Alakus, Ba'mishkan, then godliness is brought down into the Beis HaMikdash, which makes a Direlei Baruch Tachteinu. So before you start building the Beis HaMikdash, there's a Vayakhel. You collect all Yidden, you collect all sparks, and the collection is done by Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, why it must be done by Moshe Rabbeinu is L'chayr explained on the end of the previous page, which we're going to learn in Mitzvah Hashem at the end of the second shiur on this Maamar, that b'chochma is beriru. That even though birudim is b'derech eslapshus, and birudim is a messy business, you have to be mislabish makam ha-mizbarer. You become dirty like the mizbarer, kol ha-ma'avik ha-menuv ha-misnavel ka-moisei. But in the end, the koyach v'bira comes from chochma, because chochma is atzmas ha-velikus. Chochma has nothing to do with the Helen Behester. So that's why Vayakhel Moshe Rabbeinu, who's chochma d'atzilus, is able to be he who collects all Yidden from whatever madreges, and is able to collect all aspects of the Tzutei Kedusha that Yidden may have had to deal with, and have dealt with, and have overcome, and succeeded with, and bring it to Elikus, and then you can build a Beis HaMikdash. Efshalias Amshachas Elikus Ba'mishkan, then you can bring godliness into the Beis HaMikdash like it was B'tchilas Habriya, U'lamayla Yosef Asul L'Mikdash V'shachanti B'seichem. Now when the Yidden built the Beis HaMikdash in the Midbar, you're not going to say that the Amshachas Alakus b'mishkan was by B'tchilas Habriya. Maybe you will say it's B'tchilas Habriya. In other words, the Beis HaMikdash itself contributes the first Beis, the Mishkan, the first Beis HaMikdash, the second Beis HaMikdash, all the Mikdashim Ma'at, Beis Rabbeinu Shebabov, Mikdash Ma'at, B'Makom, wherever the Yidden are going to be, that all of these inyanim are part of the birur. That Moshe Rabbeinu has to be the one to be ma'asif and to be malakit, because he's madama, he's chochma d'atzilus, to facilitate the proper manifesting of the Shekhinah, which the Chayda is going to be Esh L'Asad Lavi. So I'm saying something that the Maamar doesn't say. The Maamar says bepashtus that Moshe Rabbeinu collects all Yidden, Moshe Rabbeinu collects all sparks, he raises Yidden to a state of perfection, and then you're able to build a Beis HaMikdash. What I'm saying is that that's a process which didn't happen in the Midbar. It's ongoing, and it's going to be manifest fully with this gals of Melech HaMashiach take of Miyad Mamish, that then we're going to have a Beis HaMikdash from Mizak Mitzvah Sitzei, that the Beis HaMikdash is going to be a keli for the Shekhinah like it was Kedem Achet Ve'ed L'mayla Yesed V'chulu. But the point is, just like we learned in the Basiligani, that also the Mikdash V'chanti B'seichem, you want a Beis HaMikdash V'akadosh Baruch Hu, you have to make a skafia v'eshapcha, you have to struggle with the world, and only through this can you be mamshach al-kus into this world. In this Maamar, it's represented by the words Vayakhel Moshe. Moshe doesn't only gather Jews, he gathers Yiddish sparks, Yiddish avodas, Yiddish struggles. And this allows for the V'asol Mikdash V'chanti B'seichem to be B'tachas HaShleimos, as it's going to be L'Yasad Lavi. And of course I can't help but tell the story that we always tell. The story is in the Kutasiches. The Rebbe told the story that the previous Rebbe's maternal grandfather, whose name he carries, and I have the same name, Yosef Yitzchak, he was the Eidim, the son-in-law of the Cherkasses, Tzedek's son. So he married the daughter of the Cherkasses Rebbe, who was the grandson of the Nachman Rebbe, the son of the Matlat Rebbe, who was a famous Rebbe in the Derech of Chassidei Poland. And he did not agree with the derech of Chabad, the being Meidich with Tefillah. You know, the famous mashal they used to say that if you don't want the Yetzer Hara to bother you, don't let him get into the wagons. Like if you're traveling and someone is chasing after you, if you go very, very fast, they can't catch up to you. And this was the sheet of the Tzaddik Poil that happened very quickly. So the Rebbe said that the Baal Shem Tov once said, the Rebbe said, Loshen Dachzach. This is Dachzach. What does it mean? The Rebbe says, I'm not Dachzach, I think. When the Rebbe says, I think, that means there's a sure I think. I think for sure. That the Baal Shem Tov gave a mashal that Taki, you could whip the horses and run from the enemy that's trying to catch up to you, so long as he hasn't climbed into your wagon. But once he climbs into your wagon, you have to stop the wagon and you have to beat him up and you have to kick him out. No, then can you keep moving? And that's why you have to have Chabad. Arichas atfila, his bonanos kedem atfila, his bonanos b'shas atfila, his bonanos b'shas alimot, b'shas kedem atfila, b'shas atfila. That all of this refines us. It deals with a Yetzer Hara, with halamas v'estedim, with the Zachen was tegnisht, and brings us closer to Lakus. So, when the Beis Rivka became the son of the Cherkasser didn't want to daven the derech of Chabad, he wanted to daven the derech of Chassidei Poil, which is quick. He didn't want to tell his father-in-law the truth. I mean, he was probably a teenager when he got married, as was the custom. But at the same time, he was a Chabadnik. He was born in a Chabad house. His father was a Chabad rebbe, the rebbe the Tzemach Tzedek. So when his father-in-law asked him how he davens, he said these words: Ich bin sich mishtadel zu daven in betzibur. I have effort myself to daven betzibur. Now, literally, tzibur means with a minyan, but figuratively, tzibur means with a collection, with an asifa. Like Chassidus brings about the word shma, miloshan vayeshama shal, to gather, to collect. Bottom line is, he davened all day long, and his father-in-law said to him, "I thought you daven betzibur." He says, "Yeah. The meaning of tzibur is to gather. I try to gather together all the disparate parts of myself. And when I daven, all of me davens. Like it says in the Derech Mitzvah Yisrael about the of Tamam Tiyah, all of you has to daven." And that's Vayakhel Moshe. Vayakhel Moshe means all the Yidden, every aspect of a Yid has to be gathered. All the Ritutz Kedusha that are a consequence of the Halamas Vestedim, of the challenges, have to be gathered, and then you could make a Mishkan, a Mikdash, Le'yiz Barach, Kemitzvah, Zetzenechas, the Eibishter wants, like it was Kedem Hachet, and even higher than that. Okay, so I managed to drag my feet so incredibly slowly. I mean, the sheet is well over 20 minutes, and I read 2 tiny paragraphs. I just set up the sheet, the Maamar, and then we learned the beginning in Vayakhel. Let's now go to the Maamar. Okay, let's go back to the first page, which is page 72. And remember that this Maamar is about the kiyur, and the fact that the kiyur is made with maris. And maris means tools that help you see, which denotes that you can't see directly. You need to see indirectly. And the argument that this is true, not only of the maris aspakladia she'eina meira, but even aspakladia meira is also a tool that allows you to see indirectly. And the Rebbe is going to ultimately argue that the fact that you don't see directly is a chesaron, which brings about a very big maila, as you'll see in the Maamar itself. So here we go. V'hine, number 4 on page 72. Afa pisha mishkan winyan kloli. We just established that the idea of building a Hashem a home is something fundamental and basic. It's divided into various different aspects, and the aspects are chatzar eyel meid, the court of the eyel meid, the sanctuary itself, the Holy of Holies, that it says in Zayar. And it's brought Maamar Chassidus, Shegimel, Bechina Selim, Keneged Gimel, Achalukas Akloli, so we say the Ishtalshalos, the Chotzer, and the Heichel. And the Kedesh HaKadoshim correspond to the all of Ishtalshalos and the Loshen HaZayeris. Tlas Almin Inun, there are 3 basic worlds, which are not Bri Yitzir Nasiyah, but Elam is saying Sesh Lefnei Atzilos, Kedesh HaKadoshim represents godliness above Atzilos, which is called Gili of Etzem and Musav Ein Seif. And then, of course, you have Elam Atzilos, which is the Gili Buhus of Ha'ara of Ein Seif. And then you have Elam B'Yabd, only Metzias of Ein Seif. So the whole Beis HaMikdash, although in general it's one big idea, specifically it's 3 ideas. Even though the curtains are makif, they surround the Beis HaMikdash and they make it into one unit. There's also subdivisions, and the Rebbe again divides it up into 3. Yiriyas Tatachtenis, Yiriyas Ezim, and Yiriyas Eidis, Elim Adam, and Veiris Tchashim. And I don't know if these 3 are aligned with these 3, but you have in the first chelik of Ayin Beis and Arichas about Hayikra Madreges and Makif that has to indirectly with Kalim. Or Mikosh Kain, and even more so, but Kli HaMishkan, the vessels of the Mishkan, which are Kalim, that is Pnimi, like it says in Derech Mitzasech and Binyan HaMikdash. And the Kalim represent Pnimi as Mamish, so for sure you have his Chalka. So you have essentially 3 times 3. You have 3 in the Kalim, 3 in the Medurim, in the rooms, and 3 in the Makif, and 3 in the Yiriyas. So the Mishkan, which is one klal idea, is actually broken down into pratim. And I must be candid and observe that the Rebbe is not going to explain this at all going forward. He's simply telling this to you now, that the Mishkan on the one hand represents a klal, which is negated to the klal of Yisrael, and specifically it's divided up as the Maamar breaks it down into what we're going to call 9. 3 categories of kalim, 3 categories of rooms, and 3 categories of roofs, of makifim, and that's it. And now the Rebbe moves on to the bottom of page 72. V'hine Hakon, the clause to Mishkan, the general preparation for all the deals of the Mishkan, is the pasuk that says Vasisa Kir Necheshes. You have to make a water basin from copper. V'kan Necheshes, and its leg is also from copper. The Rach said that the Kohanim should wash their hands. The Kohanim should wash their hands. And of course, you know that the bulk of Melechas HaMishkan is in Pashas Truma. The Mizbeach HaPnim is in Pashas Tetzaveh, and the Kir is Dafke in Pashas Kitisa. And the Rebbe is going to make the Kir into something which is like encompassing the whole of the Beis HaMikdash. Everything in the Mishkan requires washing your hands in this water basin. Not just to go into the Beis HaMikdash, but also to bring karbanos in the court, like the pasuk says. Number 6, last on page 72, because the water basin is something so important in the way it was built, and for what it was used. The way it was built, you'll see later. And for what it was used was because you couldn't do anything in the Beis HaMikdash without first washing your hand, and washing your hand required the kiyed. Mitzah, but here we find Shagam Be'inyan says that this also required the Shtatfus Miyuchedet Shel Moshe, a special participation of Moshe. Moshe was involved in everything. Moshe gave the rules. Moshe oversaw the construction. Moshe actually put it together once it was built. Moshe was involved in everything. But the relationship between Moshe and the kid is unique. That Vayakhel Moshe Benegel Kolos Tzivi HaMishkan requires Moshe, because Moshe is the one who does all the collecting, and we just explained what collecting means. The same is true. There's a unique connection between Moshe Rabbeinu and the kir, like it says in Pekudei. Vayosam Asakir, V'yitin Shamamayim L'Rochta, V'Rochta Emenu Moshe, V'Yar Neval, V'Sdei V'Sagleim. That all the kohanim would wash their hands. Now, of course, you can right away say to me, "Excuse me, that's not unique to the kir." In Parshat Pekudei, you go through every one of the kalim. You go through the Aron, and you go through the Shulchan, you go through the Meneden, you go through the Zechapnimin, V'Yachitz, and the kir. And in each case, Moshe Rabbeinu does it. So where do you see that there's a connection between Moshe and the kir, which is different than other kalim? And the answer is, I'm not sure. But now you do see. The next thing is, there's a place where you see that the connection between Moshe and the Beis HaMikdash is different, and the kir in the Beis HaMikdash is different than the connection between Moshe Rabbeinu and the rest of the Beis HaMikdash as it relates to future generations. And what is that? Because this idea that the kir was designed for Moshe Arnu Bonav to wash their hands is Negelin, Akadehu, not just that generation, and the Gamachol, there's the subsequent generations. Kedisa Begamara, the Gemara says, Kol kir Shein Bekadel Kadosh Abba Kain Mimenu, the minimum number of kain that are kosher to wash in the kir. The Yilpel, they use, I think, 12. Enough kain to do the whole Kabbalah Tamid. But the minimum has to be 4. And if it doesn't have 4 faucets to allow 4 kohanim to wash their hands and feet at once, it's not kosher for the kir in Makachin Bey. And the proof is from this pasuk. Moshe is 1, Aaron is 2, and one of it 2 more is 4. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu washed his hands from the kir 1 week, just the week of Miluim. Once Chodesh Nisan came, Moshe was no longer the kohen, and he no longer had to wash his hands. And it remains forever a halacha that the kir has to have enough kranin, enough faucets for 4 kohanim to wash, including Moshe Rabbeinu, which means that there's a permanent remes specific to the kir that mentions Moshe Rabbeinu. You don't have that in the Shulchan, you don't have it in the Menorah, you don't have that in either Mizbeach, and I don't even think you have that in the Kedesh HaKadoshim in the Aron. So the Rebbe says, you see that the kir is an inyan klali. First of all, it's an inyan klali because you couldn't do anything in the Beis HaMikdash, any avodah, without first washing your hands. And second of all, this inyan klali required Moshe Rabbeinu. And the proof is that Moshe Rabbeinu did it in the first place. And this further proof is that Moshe Rabbeinu was connected to this kir for posterity. The kir always has to have a faucet for Moshe Rabbeinu to wash, even though Moshe Rabbeinu was a kohen for 1 week exactly. movement, which proves that which is contributing to the kiyur, is negel l'chol such as all generations. And the reason is because our kiyur in clothes, just like the Beis Hamikdash as a whole, is an Indian clothing which has to do with dinner, but Achei Temimim and even higher, the kiyur also is an Indian clothing. First of all, you couldn't do anything in the Beis Hamikdash without first washing your hands, and second of all, because there's a permanent aspect of the way the kiyur is constructed that forces you to remember and to include Moshe Rabbeinu. Shoi. So this is the Shalom Aleichem to the Maamar. Yeah, we did the Vayakhel, and why the rebbe wouldn't start his Maamar like the rebbe Rashab started as a kiyur, as one of my former students used to say all the time, Rebske Zachen. The rebbe wanted the Maamar to be Vayakhel Maamar, even though the Maamar is really a kiyur Maamar. And the rebbe, of course, Vayakhel means to collect not just people but sparks, and it has to be done through Moshe Rabbeinu and so on and so forth. But we finish with the Vayakhel. Now we're speaking only kiyur. And what are we learning about the kiyur? That the kiyur is a basic aspect, is an encompassing aspect, is an all-inclusive aspect in the Beis Hamikdash. And that's why you couldn't do anything in the Beis Hamikdash till you washed your hands. And for posterity, Moshe Rabbeinu was connected to the kiyur. Now the Rebbe begins ubir inyan kiyur. Once we understand that the kiyur, like the Mishkan as a whole, is an inyan kloli, and therefore the special connection to Moshe Rabbeinu. Now let's talk about what the kiyur is. So the Rebbe says, when you want to know what the kiyur is, you understand it. You want to understand what the water basin represented. Consider how it was made. Because the idea of the water basin expresses itself, and the Rebbe says in Yiddish, shows itself from the various things with which it was created. Because of the pasuk says the water basin was made, but of the cheshes out of Kaaba, but Maras Sevis, with the copper mirror that should solve Yisrael Pesach made. Then of course you know what Rashi says from the Chazal, that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't want to take them because these copper mirrors were used for women to beautify themselves and to appear attractive to their husbands in Mitzrayim, when their husbands were so burdened. And using these copper mirrors in a way of being pretty and heperchatznius was Maimid Am Yisrael, like Rashi says. And Moshe Rabbeinu didn't want to take them because it's heperchatznius. And the Eibush says, you don't want to take them, heperchatznius. This is the greatest thing for me all. This created the Jewish people. And the Eibush is delighted in taking these mirrors, which were used for making women attractive to their husbands, and making it into the kiyur in the Beis Hamikdash. And of course the second aspect, which is always brought, this kiyur, which was used originally to give birth to the Jewish nation, is later used when you have the inyan of a saita. To laseth shalom ben ish le'ishte, the same kiyur was used also for the inyan of shalom bayis. So we know what the kiyur means and what the kiyur was made of. Al pi pshat, al pi medrash. But our Maamar doesn't talk about that at all. Our Maamar talks only about the Kabbalah and the Chassidus. What's the pnimis inyan kiyur? Al pi pnimis inyan. Let's start again. To explain the idea of the kiyur, we have to understand what the kiyur was made. What the kiyur means shows itself, and the Rebbe says in Yiddish, when it was constructed. As the pasuk says, with the copper mirrors. And the Rebbe doesn't at all go into the tznius issue, he goes straight to pnimius hatera. It says in Chassidus, so when it says in the pasuk mares, Loshen Rabbi Mares, many mirrors. Now, of course, you can't make a water basin from one mirror. So you have to use many, many mirrors from many, many different women who donated these copper mirrors that were very beautiful. You know, I guess today they would call it brass. They're very, very beautiful. And they're very, very reflective. People could see their own reflection in these copper mirrors. It took many of them to make one water base. So the Alter Rebbe says in Teira Eir, do not only understand because it takes many mirrors to make a water basin, but understand that it's called Maras Lashon Rab because there's different levels in Mari, and what a mirror means. Kiesh Beis Maras, there's two kinds of looking glass. Aspaklari Hameira, looking glass, which allows you to see through light, meaning that allows you to see directly. And Aspaklari She'ena means a looking glass which does not allow you to see through light, means a looking glass which allows you to see indirectly. So magnifying glass or a telescope would be considered as baklari ha'meira, And a mirror, and I would say also an electron microscope, would be considered aspakladia she'eina me'ira. You're not seeing directly, you're seeing indirectly. So Maris Lashon Rabim is not only an allusion to the fact that it takes many copper mirrors to make one water basin, it's an allusion to the fact that the different madrigas have matter. And that's how this Maamar goes. Straight to the Pnimius, straight to the Chassidus. What is the Chassidus of Maris? The Rebbe is going to explain what the aspakladia is. So Rabbi Yossi, the way it's going to work is as follows. There's going to be a very nice introduction about Gan Eden, about Gan Eden, and how Neshamas and Gan Eden are zeicha to experience Elokus. And only on page 76 is the Rebbe going to go back to the idea of aspakladia. And he's further going to say that there's two levels of aspakladia. Aspakladia me'ira, aspakladia she'eina me'ira. But in the short term, put the mirrors on a low shelf. Because what follows is not a discussion on mirrors or on looking glasses or of utensils of vision, but rather it's a discussion on Gan Eden. So we're changing the subject. We'll come back to the copper mirrors either at the end of today's class or in the second class. But let's now digress. Says the Rebbe, to explain Now I want you to know that the way this Maamar is going to go, there's going to be four things. Number one, he's going to explain what aspakladia me'ira is. Number two, he's going to explain what aspakladia she'eina me'ira is. Number three, he's going to explain that aspakladia me'ira means an avoida, the levushim gashmi of Teda mitzvahs. Number four, he's going to explain that aspakladia she'eina me'ira is the levushim gashmim of the nitzutzei kedusha and the berurim and the alamas vestedim of the world. And after he finishes explaining all four of these three things, he's going to say that in the darkness there's an advantage over not having this blockage. That's how the Maamar is going to develop. But that's later. Right now we're changing the subject. Says the Rebbe, you've mischad ha'avodah. Let's explain first the reward for avodas Hashem that a person experiences in Gan Eden. Shayishchad mitzvah. It says in Mishnah, the reward for a mitzvah is a mitzvah, meaning some people say the reward for the mitzvah is another mitzvah. And some people say the word for the mitzvah is the mitzvah itself. And some people say the word for the mitzvah is the pleasure, the oinig associated with that mitzvah. The beginning of that reward is in Gan Eden. So the Rebbe wants to study Gan Eden. As you all know, there's two in Yonam of Schar Beklalos. There's a Schar in Gan Eden, which is Ruchnius. And there's a Schar in Elam Haba, which is Gashmius. And according to Chassidus, there's the Schar in Elam Haba, which is Gashmius, is Etzem. And the Schar which is in Gan Eden is only a Ha'ara. Let me just preface, Chassidus explains, Ma'ayin Basol Ona Tohoilech. It doesn't mean two worlds, it means the same thing. It's a little bit complicated, there's contradictions in the Maamar also. But the basic understanding is you come from Gan Eden and you go back to the same place you came from. So what's the difference? Tagid is Zovin, Tagid Ikri. If you buy for $1 and sell it for $1, what kind of merchant are you? You have to buy for $1 and sell for $1.25. If you came from Gan Eden Tachten and you go back to Gan Eden Tachten, what did you gain? And the answer is a simple one. The Shomas in Gan Eden, like Malachim, are called Sichlim Nivdolim according to the Rambam. They're abstract intellectuals. Their whole world is Seichel, ideas. Ideas in such a high level that they're removed from any kind of a physical form, any kind of a form altogether. When we're in Gan Eden, before we come into this world, that's what we have, an incredible understanding of godliness, in Gan Eden of Elam HaSiyah in its level, and Gan Eden of Elam HaYetzirah in a higher level, Gan Eden of Elam HaBriyah in an even higher level, and Gan Eden of Elam HaTzilas at an even higher level. When we come into this world, we learn Torah, we do mitzvahs, and we have kavanah. And through our Torah mitzvahs, we create for ourselves garments, levushim. Those garments act as conductors, and when we go back to the Gan Eden from which our neshama came, we again are busy with Hasaga Lakis, just like before we left Gan Eden, we're busy understanding Hashem in a way of Avdallah, removed from any kind of form and any kind of physical form as we were before we were in this world. But now there's something called Tainug HaSaga. We don't only understand godliness, we actually experience the godliness itself from our understanding. And the experience of godliness itself from understanding is called the pleasure of our understanding. Behind the idea there's light or delight, and the light or the delight behind the idea, this is the godliness or the source of that idea. And that's the big difference between the neshama and Gan Eden before it was in this world, and the neshama and Gan Eden after it returns. When the neshama was in Gan Eden before it was in this world, it understands, When the neshama is in Gan Eden, after it returns, it doesn't only understand, it actually experiences the pleasure of its understanding. And as you may know, in Chassidus, one of the Meshalim for Ein Seif is delight, Tainuk. When Chassidus wants to explain Ein Seif, they use a mashal of Tainuk. And Derech Agav, in my glossary series that we're working on, one of the entries that we did is Ein Sof. I have like 10 or 11 parts already done. I have a few more parts to do in the near future. And one of the things that I explain is that one of the Meshalim to understand Ein Seif is the experience of the Ein Seif, and one of those experiences is delight, is pleasure. Why pleasure is connected to Ein Seif, I'll say it briefly, because the experience of pleasure is an experience of euphoria. When a person experiences pleasure, they call it, whatever words they use, pheromones, they call it, there's words that they use to describe the chemicals that are released that make people feel very good. The mysticism, the philosophy of it is that in the neshama there's everything. In the conscious mind and the human being as he is in a guf, everything is potential, nothing is actual. But various things that we do, even eating food, give us pleasure. And Chassidus argues that the pleasure that we're experiencing is that because of the food we eat, or the music we listen to, or the ideas that we studied, or the Pnimius HaTorah ideas that we studied, the pleasure that we're experiencing is actually experiencing the infinity of the neshama. Said in other words, the euphoria that you experience from learning Torah is a mashal for the Ein Seif which is behind the Torah. The Torah is chokhmah, Torah is intellectual, which makes it limited and complex. Behind the idea there's light, or delight, pleasure. And experiencing that pleasure is a mashal for experiencing the Ein Seif. And the way it's a mashal is because you're being raised up to a place where you have no lack, where you have everything, where nothing is missing. In more edel words, the neshama is Ein Seif. The infinity of the neshama is a richness that includes everything that could possibly emerge from the neshama. But the way you experience it as a richness, you're experiencing it as a simplicity, as a pshitus that has within itself a lot of possibility. All faculties of the neshama come from the infinite richness of the neshama. But specifically the mind, because it's the closest to the neshama, has a very special connection to that richness. So when you learn ideas and you understand them, that's finite. When you learn ideas and you understand them and you experience the richness of the neshama which is connected to that idea, it's as if you're experiencing how that idea comes from its source and the infinity of the neshama. For these reasons, and I've just done a very brief and perhaps inadequate or unclear explanation, but I do want to limit my remarks to what I just said. The pleasure you experience in Gan Eden is the Ein Seif. The understanding that you have in Gan Eden is the finitude. The pleasure you understand in Gan Eden is the infinity connected to the finitude of your understanding. And on this basis, you have in Samach Vav, in the third Maamar, in Shuvah Yisrael, which is connected to the second Maamar, Ad Ve'ad Bechlal, and Ad Ve'le'ad Bechlal, and Tu Madreges, and Ad Ve'le'ad Bechlal. Different levels of understanding are removed from one another in a finite way, because understanding in general is finite. So accordingly, different levels of understanding are separated from one another in a finite way. Different levels of pleasure, however, are separate from one another in an infinite way, which means if one person understands the same level of Atzilus, another person understands the level of Bria, and the third person understands the level of Yitzir, or to say it more precisely, one person understands the level of Chesed of Bria, another person understands the level of Vud of Bria, another person understands the level of Tiferes of Bria. Their understanding is proximate. The understanding of this Madrege, the Chochmah of Chesed of Bria, and the Chochmah of Vud of Bria, and the Chochmah of Tiferes of Bria are removed from one another in a finite way. But the Oineg HaHasaga, the pleasure from that understanding, the Tainuk from the Chochmah of Chesed of Bria, and the Tainuk from the Chochmah of Chesed of Gvura of Bria, and the Tainuk from the Chochmah of Tiferes of Bria are removed infinitely, because since you're dealing with infinity, all separations are going to be infinite. When something is limited, all levels in that construct are going to be limited, and their separations are going to be limited. When something is infinite, if there are more, if that infinity is not a plain one, but it has many levels, the difference between one level of that infinity and the second level of infinity is always going to be infinite. So all levels of understanding are removed from one another in a finite way. All levels of the pleasure from the understanding, even though this is a pleasure from understanding, and this is a pleasure from understanding, this is a pleasure from understanding, and the understandings, in quotations, are separate from one another in a finite way, the delight of that understanding is removed categorically from all levels of understanding. So because pleasure, oineg, is a mashal for Ein Seif, every single particular form of oineg is considered Ein Seif, removed from every oineg lower than it, and from every oineg higher than it. And by the way, when the Rebbe said on the previous page that there's Kalim of the Mishkan, and then there's the Medurim of the Mishkan, and then there's the Yerias would be a mashal for the oineg, and the Kalim in the rooms would be a mashal for the Seichel. And perhaps, this is why the Rebbe mentioned it, even though the Rebbe is not going to explain it later on in the Maamar, because he wants to tell you the difference between Hasagi and Gan Eden is al derech the chilik between the different Kalim of the Beis HaMikdash and different the Medurim of the Beis HaMikdash. But the Tainug HaSaga is al derech mashal the Yerias. But I just made that up. I didn't plan this. I didn't think it through before. It just came to me as I'm talking, which probably means I'm beating a kettle. So let's go back to the text, okay? So again, forget about the kiyar for a while. We're just talking about the neshama's understanding in Gan Eden, and the neshama is experiencing pleasure from that understanding. Says the Rebbe the Pshat das Faldhini being in Gan Eden. The result says in Gemara about Gan Eden that tzaddikim yeshuv tzaddikim sit, and we're talking about tzaddikim who already were in this world, and they learned Torah, and they did mitzvahs, and they earned levushim, and they earn schars when they go back to Gan Eden to sit, for they say B'Shem, they have crowns on their head representing a makif. And then in Miziv HaShechina, and they delight from the ray of the Shechina, meaning they're experiencing a ha'ara of Ein Seif. As opposed to these same neshamas in the same Gan Eden before they were in this world, they don't have any avoida, they don't have any levushim, and they don't have any schar, so they understand the lakus on a level of Havdalah, which is an incredibly high level of understanding, but it's medida v'agbala, it's not Ein Seif, it's not tainug. Achei Chassidus explains that tzaddikim yesh v'mu'unyanayis yashva. Tzaddikim sitting represents order, limitation, being settled, which represents limitation, right? Like understanding, or like the Caleb of the Beis HaMikdash and the rooms of the Beis HaMikdash. But they say the crowns on the head is representative of a lakus which is hidden, indirect, infinite. Al derech mashal the tainug in Gan Eden, or derech mashal the riyas of the Beis HaMikdash. So them sitting in Gan Eden means shenenim is ziv HaShechina, that although they're experiencing pleasure from the ziv of the Shechina, which is Ein Seif, it means that they're taking a level of alakus, which is by itself oineg, which is by itself makif, and they're bringing it into a pnimius. In other words, in Gan Eden, they're experiencing godliness, but they're experiencing godliness as connected to their understanding. And because they're experiencing godliness as connected to their understanding, the infinity of godliness is close to the finitude of the understanding itself. The godliness comes into Kalim. And that's the meaning of these words. Let's talk again. Before the neshama came into this world, he understands godliness. When the neshama goes back to the Gan Eden, it understands godliness perhaps the same way as he understood before, but now he experiences Einig HaSaga, and that Einig HaSaga has connection to Pnimius. Number 10, near the bottom of page 73. That's the difference between Gan Eden and the worlds. Even though in the world there's also godliness. There's Elokus of Bria, and there's Elokus of Yetzir, and Elokus of Asiya, but Hine. The godliness of the world is hidden. As we know that the words were created only from Shem Elokim. And Elokim is Begematria Teva. And Teva from the word Tava Ba'adas Shadaf Fatrunkin of Fardek. They're immersed, they're covered over. The godliness of Teva you don't see. That I know it may be true that even in this world, and certainly in the higher worlds, everything exists wholly and perfectly, including the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Avalu B'Helam. The godliness is hidden, and it's certainly not B'His Yashvas. Hashem came back Gan Eden, as close to Gan Eden, Elokus B'Gil, the Elokus is revealed. Meaning to say that because the Elikus is connected to Hasaga and the Hasaga is revealed, the Eliki is also revealed. We have pleasure from the ray of Shechina. The phenomena of this delight is it's something which is revealed to the person. And understand the diuk. Gilui means pnimius, that's how it comes out. The hisyashvus in Gan Eden is seichel, which is a medida v'hagbala. The oinig in Gan Eden is makiv, which is not medida v'hagbala, but it's the juxtaposition. It's because it's reseim v'reisheim and yoishvim that the tainug is connected to hisyashvus, so that the tainug is also begilui, and gilui means hisyashvus. In greater detail, it may be true, it is true, that both in Gan Eden and in the world, you have both names of Hashem Elokim, like it says, Beneged to the world, Gan Eden. Vita Vayakhel Gan Eden Mikedem. It says, Beneged to the world, Hashem Elokim Meretz V'Shamayim. Nevertheless, the world is primarily Elokim, and Gan Eden is primarily Havaya. There is a difference. When you put Havaya into Adnai, the primary word is Adnai. When you put Adnai into Havaya, the primary word is Havaya. And the difference is whether the Havaya is covered over by the Adnai or the Adnai is experiencing Havaya in a revealed way. When you put Havaya into Adnai, which means first you have an Aleph, and then you have a Yud, then you have a Dalet, then you have a K, and then you have a Nun, and then you have a Vav, and then you have a Yud, and then you have a K. The most primary thing is Adnei, Shehu Begilim, and the Shem Havaya is Behelim. And of course, in this world there may be a Havaya, but that what's experienced is concealment. Because the world is run by Shem Elokim, which is Teva. And the Havaya is Behelim. Like it says in the Pasuk that just like the Magen covers over the Shemesh, Adnei covers over Havaya. And as I was learning this, I was thinking to myself, the Magen of the Shemesh is plenty bright. The Magen of the Shemesh is plenty bright. Like Bina. You have in the Sugya of B'Kiyas HaNor. The Bina is Gilui. But it's compared to Chochmah, it's covering over Chochmah. The Magen is also Gilui, but it's covering over the Shemesh, which is even brighter. And then the same is true in the world. You don't see godliness in a revealed way. Now go to the number 10. Machon came back and then you're supposed to go where first you have a Yud, and then you have an Aleph, and then you have a K, and then you have a Dalet, and then you have a Nun, and then you have a K, and then you have a Yud. So Ikiru Shem Havaya, primarily the Shem Havaya. Vinyani Shel Shem Elokim, and the divine name Elokim is only B'Tei Shayada Yagil the Shem Havaya, that the Havaya should be brought forward to the world. But it's an in of Gilui. And this is the Pshat Shagam Gilui B'Ganei no de Sfira Samalchus. That even in Gan Eden, the Gili is through Sfiras HaMalchus, but it's through Sfiras HaMalchus in the kind of a way where the Malchus is not Mailam Master, the Malchus is Megala. Sharikol, Gil de Malchus Dafke, everything is through Malchus. Aval hu Gilead the Shem Avashal Malam Malchus, but it's Malchus in such a form that it's not hiding, it's revealing. And the Rebbe says, in other words, Malchus creates Elamis, Malchus creates Gan Eden. But Malchus creates Elamis in a way that it's Malma Master and Elikus, and it creates Gan Eden in a way which is Magala Elikus. And if you understand how it works, is Malchus creates the Olam of its own world. Let's say Malchus of Atzilus creates the Olam of Atzilus, and it creates the Gan Eden of Bria. Malchus of Bria creates the Olam of Bria and the Gan Eden of Yetzirah. And in creating the Olam of Bria, it's Malma Master, and in creating the Gan Eden of Yetzirah, it's Magala. And that's the Pshat Nenemiziv, Hashchino, that in Gan Eden there's not only Hasaga, but there's Tainug Hasaga, which is called Gili, Mahus Elikus. There's not just Metzias Elikus, there's Mahus Elikus. Like it says in Me'eri Ed, that Ziv means Yesed, and Yesed is Elam saying safe. V'nimtza, last two lines, that the Hefresh ben Gan Eden le'elam is who the difference between Gan Eden and the worlds is, like the difference between Malchus and Yesed. Or the two aspects of Malchus, which is the same thing as Yesed and Malchus. The aspect of Malchus, which is a Lakus, is Magala Lakus in Gan Eden of the next world, and the aspect of Malchus, which is Ma'alim Master, creates the Elam of that world, which also has a Havaya, but Elokim is Ma'al Master and Havaya. So we just spent a few minutes and a page and a half exploring the difference between Gan Eden and Elam. And I added, to help us understand it, that Gan Eden means Be'ikin, not the way Neshamas exist in Gan Eden before they came into this world. Gan Eden means how the Neshama experiences Gan Eden after returns to Gan Eden, because that's when it experiences the Oinig. And as the Rebbe says, the Loshen The makif is brought into Pnimius. And in the world is Helam Vahester. Now the Rebbe has a kashi. Omnom al pi hanaleni move and have a question. And the question is, Eich efshe shan neshama shebebchinas nivra. A neshama, which is a creation, tuchel lehanis meziv hashchina, should be able to have a pleasure from the delight of Shechina, which is Mahusa Lakus, which is the substance of Ein Seif Etzkabin. I guess you would call this a classic question, a Yesodis Dikakasha, a fundamental question. The foundation of the question is that Neshamas Yisrael are very unique. A Neshama is very unusual. There's nothing like it in the creation other than the Neshama. Because the way the Eibusha created his world, Vayakhel, there are some things that are Elikus and there are some things which are not Elikus. Something which is Elikus is Dveikus. Dveikus means it's one with Elikus, but it's not one with Elikus Milmata Lamaila, a bittel. First it's a Yesh and then it's Batel. It's one with Elikus Milmaila Lamata. It never had a Metzias. It's Metzias L'chatchila. Was its Dveikus and Elikus. And then Nivraim are Yesh. Nivraim are separate from Elikus. And even if they're Ruchniyazik in Nivraim, like Malachim, that are called Nivdalim, they're Metzias, and they're Hagabala, and they're not Batal Be'etzem. They can't be Batal Be'etzem. They can only Batal Yesh, which means anything which is in the category of a Nivra is going to have aspects in its existence and its avodah that are not going to be exact. In Gashmis, you have creations that don't serve Hashem at all. In Gashmis, you have creations that oppose Hashem. In Ruchnius, everything serves Hashem, but each thing serves Hashem according to its teva. And in Nevrayim, that's inexact. You're always going to, if you look deep enough and high enough and hard enough, you'll find an aspect in each Nivra's avodah which is a chesaron, which is, of course, the Pshat in the Gemara, of course, the Matat. They took Matat out of the Mesifta Dereki and they gave him Titin Pulsa de Neuda because of something that he said. He was a malach. He's a high malach, batal to the Eibishter. But because he's a nivra, even though he's a nivdal, that means he's a ruchni and not a gashmi, but he's a nivra, so there's inexactitude. A neshama is called a lakus shenasa nivra, meaning underneath every neshama is a lakus, which is dveikus. But on the outside, the neshama is nivra. Neshama is of Atzilus, say a yid like Reb Shem Vayakhel, the Baal Shem Tov, these are the examples that are brought, are in this world, or Meisha Rabbeinu, they're in this world exactly as they are Lamaila, they're Dveikus. But most Nishamis, beginning from the Shamis of Elam Abriya, are Nivra. The fact that there's a potential for Lakus underneath is exactly that. It's a potential. It's a hiddenness. It surfaces during times of Mesilas Nefesh. It surfaces during times of Nisyonis. It ultimately shows itself in all of avodah that we do Bagashmis, as it's explained by Riches in the Maamar Yigash Tafresh Samaches from the Rebbe Rashab, where he talks about the idea of Gvura, of a Yipach, that the hidden strength comes out under difficulties. But the fact remains that the Neshama is Nivra, not the Lakus. And therefore the Rebbe has a kasha. If Gan Eden, after a Neshama was in this world, and it goes back to Gan Eden, is not only Hasaga, but it's Tainug HaSaga, and Tainug is Ein Seif, how could a neshama as a nivra be masag elikus in Gan Eden? How does a neshama, which on the outside is a nivra, experience not just the understanding of elikus, but the oinig which comes after, which is the Indian of Ein Seif? That's the pshat in this kasha. And you cannot say that neshamas in Gan Eden reveal their elikus. Neshamas in Gan Eden are nivra, in whatever world they're in, whether it's in Gan Eden of Elam HaSiyah, Gan Eden of Elam HaYetzirah, Gan Eden of Elam HaBriya, and I guess on some level even Gan Eden of Elam HaTzilus. They're nivra, yatzu v'nifredu. And as such, you wonder how there can be masag elikus if elikus is Ein Seif. How they could experience Tainug in Gan Eden if Tainug in Gan Eden is a mashal for Ein Seif, and Ein Seif is dveikus, and they're nivra. That's the kasha. It's the pshat in the kasha. And again, in the Maimorim, when they talk about the neshama revealing the elikus shaboy, it's in this world. It's not in Gan Eden. In Gan Eden, it's only the nivra. It's in this world the neshama reveals its elikus in terms of circumstances of Mesilas Nefesh, Vakayetze Bezeh, and that's why the Rebbe has this kasha. How a neshama in Gan Eden is masag elikus? Because on the outside, the neshama is nivra, not elikus. Shaharei, and he explains the question. It's actually true that the neshama is a piece of Elokus mimal, from on high. And like it says in that Yem that the Rebbe Rashab told the Friedrich Rebbe. And then we add the word mamish, which again the Rebbe Rashab explained in that same Yem Gashmis, meaning that the neshama is machaber the highest levels and the lowest levels mamish. Because it's Elokus, it's able to connect the highest madreges and the lowest madreges. It's a chelik alaka. It's a piece of atzmus and Hussein Tzav Baruch. Every neshama is a shtik ebishter. But it comes down into a mitzvah called mamish. Mikom kamar yorda v'nishtalshlo v'nasal b'chinas nivra. As the neshama descends through ishtalshlos, that goes in the category of nivra, meaning to say medida v'agbala. Medida v'agbala, which has inexactitude. In other words, neshamis bepashtus are not in touch with the dvekis, which makes it a lakus. They serve Hashem as a nivra, as a yesh, very similar to a malach. Now they have a koyach of Elokus, which comes out in times of Mesiras Nefesh, in times of Tshuva, in times of Nesyenis, but that's down here, it's not Lamaila. So how is a neshama that in Gan Eden is nivra masik tainug elokiyah, not just a sog elokiyus? Ukiyadua, the Rebbe explains, Shan neshamis, we know that even though B'shar Shnei B'chinas Eir, the root of neshamis is the madreg of Eir, but Aval Yardu v'nimshach b'chinas Mayim Erakiyah, they came down to the madregas of Mayim Erakiyah, U'kumeshin is Bayer, Barucha b'drusha Chedesh Tisha b'nei Mayim Erakiyah. In Tafshin Yotes, Tishrei, the Rebbe spoke the Suga ver Mayim Erakiyah. The Basi Lagani from Yotes, which now I learned 3 years ago. This is Tafshin Pei Beis. We learned that Basi Lagani in Tafshin Ayin Tes, and before that in Tafshin Nun Tes. And I guess before that in Tafshin Lamed Tes, but then I was a child. The Rebbe spoke in the Maimorim of Tishrei Yud Tes about En Mayim Erakiyah. And it seems that throughout the year, the Rebbe refers back to the Maimorim that he spoke that Tishrei, I think in a rather unusual way. I don't think you see a pattern that the Rebbe during the course of a year will refer back to the Maimorim he said that Tishrei. But this year, Yud Tes seems to be a pattern. He spoke it in Tishrei, he revisits it. But Meshach Hashana, I never learned Tishrei Tafshin Yud Tes. I don't know how detailed the Suga of Er Mayim Erakiyah was, and whether the Rebbe spoke about Neshamas being Er Mayim Erakiyah, I don't know. But the Suga of Er Mayim Erakiyah essentially means how things start out very ephemeral until they manifest in a state which is very concrete. Oir has no form, right? Oir is a mashal for sevav kalam. Mayim, it has a form, but you could put mayim into a variety of different kalim. You put mayim into a round bowl, the water takes on the shape of being a round bowl. Put it into a square vessel, it'll take on the shape of a square vessel, and so on and so forth. So it's naide, right? It's fluid. Oir, light, has absolutely no form. Mayim has semi-form, and Rakia means how the water hardens, it takes on a concrete form. Like it translated in Bereshis, a firmament. So Oir Mayim Rakia is a mashal to explain 3 states of Oir, and often it's extended to Kesed and Chochmah and Bina, where Bina would be Rakia. Which means godliness can exist in a state which is totally abstract, which means you can make from it anything. Godliness can exist in a form which has a semi-definition, but that definition is still fluid. And then godliness can take on a concrete form which limits it absolutely. And it's a whole sugya, it's a beautiful sugya, Oir Mayim Rakia. I like the sugya Oir Mayim Rakia. I feel like it's in the yeshivish culture a little bit neglected, because it's not about hishtalsos, it's in from higoyin. You can use Oir Mayim Rakia in 1,000 different circumstances, and you can use Oir Mayim Rakia to represent 1,000 different things. Each phenomena can exist in a totally ephemeral state which is Oir, a completely limited state called Rakia, and an intermediate state which is called Mayim. Now here, the Rebbe is applying the discussion of Oir Mayim Rakia to the Neshama, which is interesting. Because the rule is that Neshamas are associated with Kalim, not with Oir. If you're familiar with my Maamar, right, Neir Havaya Nishmas Adam, just like you have Neir Mitzvah V'Teira, you have Neir Havaya Nishmas Adam. And the rule is Neir Hashem Nishmas Adam, that the Yiddish Neshama compared to the candle means not the fire and the light, it means the receptacle, the keli, right? It says in the Maamar, Lansesh Balaz, the vessel that holds the fuel in the wick, or the fuel in the wick itself. The fire is above the Neir. And as a rule, just like by Neir Mitzvah, V'teira eir, the mitzvah is oir, the neder is a keli. So by ner neshama, it's the same thing. The neder is a keli. Some Maimorim bring, you have it Nayim Beis and in other places, that there are some neshamas that are the fire, like Rav Shimon bar Yochai. And that's how it is in Tanya. In Tanya Perek Yates, Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, the neshama is compared not to the keli which holds the fire, but to the fire itself. So my understanding is, without getting into too much complexity, is that most neshamas are representative of keli. That means godliness, but as it's what's called dveikus built in ikeres, not overt directed to the Eibishter. There are rare neshamas that the madrega of oyer. So what the Rebbe says here, that neshamas go through 3 steps of er ma'im rakia. Oyer doesn't mean here oyer as opposed to keli. Oyer means here that the neshama's existence, that's called a chelik. A chelik means a keli. It means a thing of substance, of self-identity, can exist in such a theoretical state that it's like light, has no form whatsoever. And rakia would mean that the neshama is absolutely, concretely formed and limited. And the Rebbe is arguing that just like the philosophical concept of er ma'im rakia can be used in so many different circumstances to mean so many different things, that in each case the model of oyer ma'im rakia would be, oyer means how that thing exists in a totally ephemeral state, and rakia means how it's absolutely concrete and limited, and ma'im is an intermediate condition. Is true of the neshama as well. And again, we're not talking here about the neshama like Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai or the Baal Shem Tov or Moshe Rabbeinu, that down here they're considered fire, the light. We're talking about typical neshamas, and typical neshamas are connected to kelim, and kelim are yatzu v'nifredu, like it says in Tanya. Kelim are designed to be separate. Now Chassidus is going to argue that the idea that the neshama, the kelim, are designed to be separate means it has a higher source. Like you learn in Chassidus that the source of kelim is higher than the source of oyer, but it's separate from its source. Helam and Avdol and Agbal and Eschalkos, the way a keli manifests, it's the vekes built in nikir, and the same is true of a neshama. So a neshama may have an extraordinarily high source, but the way the neshama manifests, it goes away from that high source where it exists in a state of oyer, and it comes down to a rather actual manifestation, which is al derech mashal rakia, where it's not only limited but it's nivra. There's no dvekes at all. Like I said to you before, that neshama has this unique duality of a lakus shenasa nivra. It's both a lakus, which means underneath it has a dveikus and it has an ein seif, but it's also nivra on the outside of medida v'agbala. So a neshama in Gan Eden may have a status, a state, a station, where even though it comes from kelim, its reality is al derech mashal oyer, meaning to say it's very ephemeral, doesn't have a very defined form, and perhaps in that state it's a lakus, or in that state it's able to be masig a lakus. But the way the neshama actualizes itself through hishtalshelus, or it's actualized by HaKadosh Baruch Hu through hishtalshelus, and the way the neshamas come into the ilam is even ilam atzilus, and certainly the lower worlds, it's a nivra, it's medida v'agbala, and it's al derech mashal in the scheme of the emer aleph mem reish er ma'im rakia, like the idea of rakia. And therefore the question is, in Gan Eden, understanding a lakus is wonderful. That's called being a nivdal, not having a gashmi is dikir tzir, having a lakus havdalah. But oineg is a mashal fein seif. How could a neshama, which even if it's a ruchni, but it's not an eliki, it's a nivra, it's not a lakus, tolerate an experience of ein seif? And that's his question. I'm on the last words on page. Let's read it again. Okay, do Hashem said. Perhaps there's a level where neshamas exist in a station, which is the madrega of eir, which means the neshama's self-identity is very vague to the extent that you could state that it's still in touch with its alakus, even though it comes from kelim. Aval, however, your then takes on the intermediate stage, the fluid form called mayim, and the concrete firmament, fixed state, called rakia kumavu arbaruch abdrushay chedish tishis, as I discussed this past tishrei tafshin yotes b'inyan er ma'im rakia. And again, I did not learn those maimarim ever. I certainly didn't learn them recently, so I do not know whether the Rebbe developed the sug of er ma'im rakia b'negei to neshamas or only b'negei to hishtalshalos. But the bottom line is this: rakia hu aglidu ma'ir. Rakia means where the water becomes niglad, congealed, hard, fixed. And mayim is fluid. It's still in its fluid state, can take up any shape. When it descends from the madrega of mayim to madrega of rakia, it's like water freezing. It becomes a solid, it becomes fixed. And the neshama goes through a similar process. It may have once been in a station called oyer, and then later in a station called mayim. But when it comes down to the condition called rakia, the neshama is formed and limited and a nivra. And the question therefore becomes, how is it possible? Once the neshama achieves its status as a nivra, which is bebechinas rakia. And this is true certainly in the shamas of briyat and asiya, and I'm going to argue even in shamas of atzilas, as long as they're in the madrega of yatzav and nifredu. How is it possible to be able to delight from a ray of the Shekhinah? In other words, not from the hasaga that you have in Gan Eden, but from the time of hasaga you have in Gan Eden. And the Rebbe doesn't finish now. He spends the entire page persisting with the question, arguing the question more and more. And the question is compounded further by the following truth. And when you read this page, you'll understand why I gave you the introduction that I gave you to Gan Eden, where I explained that one level of hasaga from another level of hasaga is separated in a limited way, but one level of oynik from hasaga and the second level from oynik from hasaga are separated in an infinite way. We all understand that the phenomena of worlds and the phenomena of Gan Eden are separated from each other in a way which is called ein arech, incomparable. What I like to call quantum separated. You can't go from a world to a Gan Eden, because worlds are limited, and Gan Eden is a limited environment where there's a revelation of Ein Sof. In other words, if you wanted to divide it up into three, the way I teach it in the Maamar and the Samach Vav, which I haven't taught in a decade or more, there's a world which is entirely limited. There's a world where the Ein Sof is without any hakava, it's absolute Ein Sof, what we call atzmos. And in between those two, there's a world where you have finitude that's qualified by something infinite, like you're understanding an idea that's limited, and the pleasure from that idea, which is the mashal for the experience of Ein Sof, is infinite. And Gan Eden is that middle step, like it's explained in the second Maamar of Samach Vav, and then a little bit in the third Maamar of Samach Vav, that Gan Eden is not atzmos of Ein Sof. It's Gan Eden, and it's not Eden. Eden would be atzmos of Ein Sof, but there's a gili of Ein Sof in Gan Eden nevertheless. And Olam is absolutely limited. So they have a different category. And he proves it, the difference between the worlds, which are limited, and Gan Eden, which is a limited environment that experiences Ein Sof, would be the difference between Nivra and Bayre. Wow. Between being a creation and being creator. And again, when the Rebbe says here the word Bayre, he doesn't mean Bayre Atzmus Amhus. He means Ne'etzal, he means Atzilus, he means Alakus, he means Dvekas. And he explains, which is why we find Shaliyah Me'el Gan Eden, when Neshama is in a world, and he has to go up into Gan Eden, and Neshama is in this world, and has to leave this world and to go back. And this is explained at length in the second Maamar of Samach Vav. You have to tevel in a river of fire, which is based on a pasuk, right? When the Har Dinur Nafik. To forget the countenance of this world, only afterwards able to go into Gan Eden. The reason is ascending from a world to a Gan Eden is ascending from an environment which is absolutely finite to an environment which is finite, that is complemented and qualified by something which is infinite. In other words, it's Ein Sof. This is Aliyah Shebe'ein Arech. And of course, in the Maimorim, they actually say two different things. They bring the pasuk that you have to have a nahadin, or a river of fire that the neshama goes through in order to forget the world, to go up into Gan Eden, and then they bring from the Sefer Abad that there's an amud, a beam of light which raises the neshama up. So the nahar dinur cleanses the neshama from its lower state and qualifies it to go into the higher world. But that alone doesn't bring it into the higher world. Then there's a beam of light which raises it up from the top down into Gan Eden. If we were talking about ascending from one level to another level, where the separation between one and the next would be gradual, limited, measurable, you wouldn't need to, and in fact you wouldn't want to, forget the first step in order to come to the second step. To be sure, what I understand in the earlier step is it's a preparation and introduction. It allows you to go up to the higher level of understanding. And therefore, you would build on your past. You wouldn't want to forget your past. It says, that takes 40 years a person to reach a level of understanding, and this teacher understands. But it's not like it's a magic thing, it's not like Schwindeltrepp. For 39 years and 11 months and 29 days you don't understand anything, and then when it comes to the 40th year, boom, you understand anything. That's not the way that works. It's a gradual process, and you build on everything you learned until you reach the stage of Arboim Shnin. 40 years ago your Rebbe taught you, and you continuously revisit what you learned 40 years ago from your Rebbe. Everything he learned and reached in what his teacher taught him 40 years ago. Over the course of 40 years you rethink it and you rethink it and you rethink it. So the teacher taught you 40 years ago. Over the 40 years, you revisited the Divrei Harav again and again. And then ultimately you reach the level of the teacher's understanding. You reach the depth and the dimension of Seichel in the 40 years. So it's a gradual build. And what you heard 40 years ago isn't forgotten. The way you understood it 39 years ago isn't forgotten. What you understood 30 years ago isn't forgotten. It gradually gets you to the point that after 40 years, you understand what the Rav understands. This is in a similar form. The ladder is standing on the ground, and the head of the ladder reaches up into the heavens. The ascent from one step to the next step is dafkai de agdomos hasogo b'madrega. Kedem is first. You understand it in the first madrega. Ukumei hali is b'dargas asul, like the first steps, the first lower rungs of a ladder. And then you reach the higher steps. So you're building on the old. So you don't forget what you learned before, you accumulate it. And the Rebbe concludes, when you're talking about ascending from one level to another level, which is gradual, you build on the old, you don't want to forget it. Now, we're all Talmidim of Rabbi Khan. And when Rabbi would get to such a vart, where there's growth that's gradual, and then in a moment, the Rebbe is going to talk to us about growth, which is quantum, which is not gradual, which is be'ein harech. So one of the Machon that he would use in the shiurim is the mashal of shmi and riyah. You learn something from your teacher, you hear it and you understand it. Then you hear more and you understand it better. You hear even when you understand it better. But nothing compares to seeing. Seeing is be'ein harech. And a teacher who has a student that he's able to teach him not b'derech shmiyah but b'derech riyah, which of course means ruach hakodesh. This you cannot build on the old. This requires a quantum change. Quantum means an absolute change where there's no gradualism. You don't get there through steps. You jump. And jumping involves forgetting the old to come into the new. And that's the difference between what separates one understanding from another understanding versus experiencing the delight of that understanding, as I explained to you earlier in this shiur, which is a mashal for Ein Sof, which is a quantum separation. Moreover, if a person understands Elokus and he has the timing of that Elokus, and then he wants to understand the Elokus on a higher level and experience the Oinig on a higher level, so the Hasaga and the Hasaga are measurably separated, gradually separated. But the Oinig and the Oinig are quantum separated, and to go from one to the next, you have to have Shikha. However, when one wants to ascend not from one level of understanding to another level of understanding, but from a world to Gan Eden, which means from understanding to experiencing the Oineg, the Mahus, the delight of Elokus, connected to that understanding, you have to forget how the world looks in order to be connected to understanding Gan Eden. Says the Rebbe Harei Move, and the very fact that the process by which a neshama leaves this world and goes to Gan Eden is not by building on what he has in this world, but by forgetting this world to come into Gan Eden, that proves it's an incomparable ascent. It's a quantum leap from the world to Gan Eden. And again, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that this is talking about Gan Eden after the neshama was in this world. Because the Gan Eden, before the neshama was in this world, there's only a hasaga. Never then it's mufshet, never then it's muvdal, never then it's without gashmis, never then it's without mitziyas, never then it's without seer. But this is limited and this is limited. The true idea that Gan Eden is a place of Ein Sof, that in order to go into Gan Eden you have to have shikha, you have to forget the world, is when you're talking about the pleasure, the delight, which is an experience of the Ein Sof, of the mitzvahs, the kavaras ha-mitzvahs, and the understanding we had of Torah in this world. It's not only true when you ascend from the world to Gan Eden. where in Gan Eden you're not only understanding Elikus, but you're experiencing Einig Eliki. But the same is also true by Liyas Madrega Madrega Sheba Gan Eden Gufa. If you're in one level of Gan Eden and you want to go to a second level of Gan Eden, since Eden means pleasure, and Gan Eden means how pleasure is, how did Rebbe say it before? There's a Hisyashvus, and the Oynik comes on into a Pnimi, so there's a Ribu Madregas of Asaga Lakis, and the Rib Madregas of Tainu that comes from the Asaga Lakis, and even if one Hasaga to compare to another Hasaga, is separated in a way of Adviad Bechlal, limited. The separation from one delight from Hasaga, from the second delight from Hasaga, is Adviad Bechlal, like it says in the beginning of the third Maamar in Samach Vov. The Av Shekola Madregas Nikolim B'Shem Gan Eden, all levels are in the category of Gan Eden. Each level of Gan Eden, in terms of the delight of Gan Eden, is incomparably removed from the level below it, and incomparably removed from the level above it. And the reason is since we explained it in Gan Eden, you have the Gili of Yesed, not just Malchus. In other words, you have the Gili of Pnimius HaMalchus, not just Chitenius HaMalchus, which is Seif Kanal, which means that you're experiencing a trace of godliness, as the Rebbe used the word in the previous page, in the beginning of the second paragraph. The word Mahuz, Hainu Sha'eda Bechinas Beligavul, so whatever level of Gan Eden you're on, in as much as you're experiencing Yesed, in as much as you're experiencing Pnimius HaMalchus, you're experiencing infinity, godliness. And once we're talking about Beligavul, each Gan Eden compared to another Gan Eden is Beligavul, separated Legabe Madregas Gan Eden Shalamata Mimena and Legabe Madregas Gan Eden Shalamayla Mimena. So there's a lot of levels in Gan Eden. The Yeshvim, the Hasaga, is not infinitely separated from one Gan Eden to the next Gan Eden. But the Reisayim B'Reishayim, the Tainug of Hasaga, is categorically separated, and therefore to go from one Gan Eden to another Gan Eden, you have to go back to the same river of fire, to a different river of fire, to Amud, to go from one world to the next. Just like there's a Nahar Dinur that you have to go through, go from this world to Gan Eden, you have to have a Nahar Dinur to go from one Gan Eden to the next Gan Eden. And of course, the way it's explained in the Maamar, you have Gimel Aliyas B'chol Yom, and then you have a big Aliyah on the yard side for Chuli, and each time you're making a quantum leap. As you ascend from one Gan Eden to a second Gan Eden, you have to totally bittel your reach from the earlier stage. Not because the understanding is separated in an infinite way from the other understanding, but because the delight of that understanding, the Einig Eliki of that understanding, the Elikus of that understanding, is Bein Arech to the other Elikus. Like it says in Samach Vov, in the second Maamar, about the need to go to a river of fire and then to be pulled up from the top by a beam of light which shines from the higher Gan Eden to raise you up from your state into the higher Gan Eden. The reason for this river of fire and this beam of light is because you ascend from one world to the next is Bein Arech in Gan Eden. So the Rebbe says, first of all, when you talk about a neshama, you must understand that the neshama is nivra, as per the conversation of Eir Ma'im Rakia, that the neshama is b'medida v'agbala. And second of all, the Gan Eden is believable. The neshama is finite, as represented by the sugi of Eir Ma'im Rakia, and the Gan Eden's tainug is believable, as represented by the sugi of Nahadi Nur and Amud. So the question is a simple one. The neshamas may be chelik al mamish, but they're designed to manifest as a nivra. And in as much as the neshama is manifest as a nivra, how could a nivra be a keli for hasaga of elikus of any level? And the Rebbe finishes Makei Metinu Gam Binyan Tate. In Tate itself, you find these two ideas, where you can ascend from one level to the next level, which is in a finite way, so you build on the old. And when you can ascend from one level to another level in an infinite way, you have to forget the old to come into the new. So bebechinis beligavul lagabe elam, and nevertheless, hine b'teira gufa yesh gam kein. There's two steps. There's aliyas be'erech and there's aliyas be'ein erech. When aliyas be'erech, you're learning on a higher level of the same Talmud Bavli. You build on the old. But then you have aliyah be'ein erech. For example, k'vishamatinu, but Rabbi Zed, find Rabbi Zed again. This is also brought in the second Maamar Samach Vov. Rabbi Zed, it's some me'at anisi. He fasted 100 fasts or 40 fasts. Lishkach Talmud Bavli, to forget the form of Talmud Bavli, to learn the form of Talmud Yerushalmi. Which means that even in Limud HaTeira, because the Teira has ein arech Bavli legabe Yerushalmi, you have to forget the old to come into the new. And certainly when you're talking about the taimei Teda, the tainug of Teda, that is an ein arech. And therefore the question is back. I want to repeat again what I said before. The question. How is it possible? In as much as the neshama is a nivra, and in Gan Eden there's no doubt that neshamas are limited. The infinity of the neshama which is going to be revealed to us at Lovei, and the infinity of the neshama which could be revealed now is only here in Elam Hazeh, through Nesyenis and Tshuva and Avodah and Birudim, not in Gan Eden. Tuchel lyhadus b'zeh Gan Eden should understand at all Tainuk, which is linyan of Ein Seif. Shubachidus bli gavul, especially b'chidus hayin shebagan Eden. So the Rebbe just spent close to 3 amudim. You forgot it. Forget about Vayakhel. We didn't even forget that. We forgot that we forgot it. We forgot about the Kir and the Maras HaTzovis. We started talking about Gan Eden. And we had a conversation of what Gan Eden means. And of course I added that there's a Gan Eden before the Neshama comes into this world, that it's only Asaga. And there's a Gan Eden after the Neshama returns to Gan Eden, but now it has Lavushim, so it has the Tainug HaSaga. And the Iker HaKashi is Tainug HaSaga is Ein Seif. How could a Neshama be Masag Elokus? And the Rebbe gives an interesting answer. Turn to page 76. Achei the teretz is that the Eibush gives him a Lavushim. Now, if you look at the Maamar, he's mitzayin to get his Achei Temimim Chav Tes. Footnote 37, he's mitzayin to get his Achei Temimim Chav Tes. And then in footnote 41, he's weiter mitzayin to Siman Chav Tes, where the Alter Rebbe asks the same question. That neshama is limited and Gan Eden is infinite. How can a neshama which is finite be masik Gan Eden which is infinite? So the Rebbe answers that the Eibishter gives us the lowest madrega of the infinity of Gan Eden, which is called Ratzon versus Einig. And the lowest madrega of infinity, because it's infinite, gives us a garment to be able to conduct, to be able to receive the infinity of Gan Eden without imploding. I guess the Mashal Gashmi for it would be diamond dust. When you want to cut diamonds, you'd use those. I was a bocher, I went for a while to 47th Street, the Hasidic capital of Manhattan. In those days, there were a lot of young alite cutting stones. Now, I don't think you make a living doing it, but then it was a panosa. A lot of Yidden came after the war. I mean, a lot of my friends, their fathers worked as pushing as diamond cutters. You had a wheel, and they always had, their hands were always black because they were touching that wheel. But the wheel spun very quickly, and then they would sit and cut the stones, and they would look at them and cut and look and cut and look. It was a big chokhmah. But it wasn't the wheel. It was they put on the wheel diamond dust. And the diamond dust, to cut a diamond, you need a diamond, because nothing else is hard enough. Metal is not hard enough. So this is the mashal. That in order to conduct Ein Seif, you need a little bit of Ein Seif. So the Alter Rebbe in Tanya says that the Eibishter gives us the lowest madrega of Ein Seif, which is called the Ratzon, to be able to conduct the higher madregas of Ein Seif, which is called Tainuk, Ne'am Avaya. And what is the Ratzon? Mitzvahs. Because mitzvahs are Ratzon Ha'elyon, Katzin Ratzon Kata Atrenu. So the levushim of mitzvahs allow us to conduct the Tainuk of Ein Seif. That's in Tanya. And the Rebbe is basically saying that here, although he doesn't spell it out. And as pertains to our Maamar, that's going to be this whole business of Maras HaTzovis. But the Maras HaTzovis, as it relates to the Kiyah and to the Beis HaMikdash, we'll say that all for the next class. Today, let's just learn the teretz to the kasha. If a neshama is a l'kus shenasa nivra, emphasis on the word nivra. How could a neshama be masag einig eliki? A, the neshama is limited al derech the sug of mayim rakia. B, the hasag is unlimited al derech the inyan of shikha. Ach inyan hu the teretz is shazehu al derech. The answer to how a neshama that's nivra could be masag elikus, which is bligvul, which is Ein Seif, which is dveikos. It's balderech beinyan vayavim meisha b'teichar v'yalahar meisha ben goes into a cloud, and he ascends to the mountain. Of course, this is the pasuk in Parshas Mishpatim, and there are Maamorim on this pasuk that explain this process, that you have to have a lavush even from Meisha Rabbeinu to masag elikus. Goes up to heaven physically. And lachem loyachal omayim loyshasa, there was no food and drink in the physical sense at all. Right? Aboim yoim loyachav loyshasa, but lachem abira bachalish, the pasuk says in Tilim, he ate food of malach. And look in footnote 39, signed to Gemara and Yuma, and to a Teireh, and to Lekut HaSichos. Lachem shamalach ashar sechem, he ate metaphysical food. And this medical physical, shayanizim is evashchina, was like eating godliness itself. Says the Rebbe. Now, of course, mon is also lechem abidim. But mon is lechem abidim that takes on a physical form. Because God love and v'tamek it's apiches b'dvash. And l'asad love is going to be called lechem panog. But in Gan Eden, Moshe Rabbeinu ate lechem abidim the way abidim eat it, as a ruchniistic thing. So the Rebbe says, well, the question becomes, how can a creation, in this case Moshe Rabbeinu, and of course you all know the famous Sipur, that the Mezritcher Magid instructed his son Avram the Malach, the angel, that he should eat and watch his health. And of course in Nitzavah it says, Aklein lecheli in guf, and Aklein lecheli in the neshama, v'chuli v'chuli. And the Malach said famously, Ich bin nicht mechuyev abzulassen mein Taten in Himmel for a fleishik and Taten. I have no obligation to forsake the will of my Father in heaven for my Father of the flesh. Bachad morazoken v'yomer. So the Alter Rebbe cried and he said, how could you say about the Mezritcher Magid, a fleishik and Taten, a father of the flesh? It was a Mezritcher Magid. The Mezritcher Magid said about the Baal Shem Tov, that the Baal Shem Tov would not tell him personally that he was a Elud Isha, he wouldn't believe it. The Baal Shem Tov would not tell him himself that he had a physical father and mother and that he was born through a physical process. The Baal Shem Tov, the Magid said, I wouldn't believe it. And you could assume that the Vestach din v'cheshbon rather than cheshbon v'din, that the Malach hat sich gesagt auf Baal Shem Tov, the Magid hat sich gesagt auf Baal Shem Tov, die gepasken dechet auf sich allein. And they were talking about Moshe Rabbeinu. So however we understand it, somehow this is also a guf, like the steep in the back in the Tilim, gam guf kodesh basaru. So the shaila is 4 lines into the page, Eich Efshen, how is it possible, Shenivra, Moshe Rabbeinu, Yenizim Ezev Ashchina, should be sustained by ruchniistic food. Afilu mitzad neshama, even if you're talking about the neshama being fed by this ruchniistic food, it's also hard to understand, because it's the neshama that's a lekus shenase nivra, and kol shel v'kal v'chemed the guf, or befrat mitzad the guf. And Moshe Rabbeinu was in a physical body, and the physical body needs physical food. Here, his physical body was not being fed by metaphysical food; it was being fed by divine food. Harei guf yagash meshal Moshe. Moshe Rabbeinu's physical body, let alone his neshama, was nizim ziv hashchina, was be sustained by ziv hashchina. In this Maamar, we're saying that even the neshama is mugbal by Moshe Rabbeinu dafman kleden, but the guf is certainly mugbal. How could a guf be nourished directly from Ein Seif? And the answer is in the pasuk right away. Moshe went up Lamaila through a cloud, and again, this is in a lot of Maamarim. Here it's bekitzer. It's a garment. The effect of the cloud was the cloud diminishes the concentration of the radiance and the brightness of the light. It doesn't hide it completely. But because it limits in part, what comes through is a lesser light. And the lesser light, Moshe Rabbeinu is able to experience. And that's the pshat of Moshe under the lavush. And again, ha'oras, they compare it to what says in the Ger Sakej Siman Chavtes. The vart is that the lavush of Onan was also Ein Seif. But in the Tanya it says it's safe madregas Ein Seif. It was somehow, because it was itself Ein Seif, able to limit, but on the other hand, because it's Ein Seif in a lower form, it was able to affect that Moshe Rabbeinu should receive the Ein Seif in such a diminished way, they should be able to receive it. V'dugmas Adam hareyu mistakel, it's comparable to a person who is looking and staring be'er tzach at an incredibly bright light, through a transparent looking glass, meaning a looking glass that allows him to see the light directly. But in this case, even though the looking glass allows him to see the light directly, it diminishes it enough that he should be able to see it. The looking glass diminishes the power of the radiance. It allows him to receive the light in a diminished way, even though he's receiving it directly. And the Rebbe concludes, Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah, because Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah should not be bazeh, which is about Vayamida. Moshe Rabbeinu saw Lukus directly, not indirectly. Didn't see it through a Machon. But the Lukus, which he saw directly, had to be diminished. And because there was the garment of the Onan, which is itself Ein Seif, but it's the Seif of Ein Seif, and therefore acts as a malbush that allows Moshe Rabbeinu to receive the Ein Seif. Vayakhel lyhadus nizim is Ashchina is able to receive Ein Seif, and it was him as Einis. And the Rebbe continues and he says, the same is true about every neshama. That the kasha was, how could a neshama in Gan Eden, which even though it may have started out elokus, and elokus the madrega of oyer, but it's manifest as nasa nivra as compared to the madrega of rekia. How could it experience the tainig of elokus, which is ain't safe? And again, neshama is in Gan Eden. In other words, not like Moshe Rabbeinu, that he had a problem with his guf, but just a regular yid was a problem just with his neshama, that the neshama is also limited. Chateiru mitzvahs, him chachmos, heritin shal HaKadosh Baruch Hu teiru, mitzvah the wisdom and will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That the yordu with the slap shul amatichem to the physical world, but they're ain't safe. So how could the neshama in Gan Eden have oinik from ain't safe? Says the Rebbe, because they came down lamata, they bedugmas as paklaria, made it like the looking glass, which is radiant but limits. Harashem Nasem Lavush, the Torah and mitzvah to do in this world, become the garment. And this taka, which says in the Geras Kedesh Chavtes, La Neshama Bagarin to the Neshama in Gan Eden shall yud yodam tuchal lehez mitzvah ashchina, which allows the Neshama to have a pleasure from the light of Ein Seif, from a tainuk, from a ha'ara of tainuk of Ein Seif. Kimvu b'tani b'kitzad, like it says in Bekitzad, the Rebbe is mitzayin to Geras Kedesh Simon Chavtes. I mean, the Meitzim La'ed, the Maamar is built in Muga. To get the Kedesh Simon Chavtes, and I added to look and save Perek Daled and Perek Nun Beis in Tanya. But Moshe Rabbeinu had to have this asaga through his guf. We have this asaga through our neshama, and in both cases the question is the same, and the answer to it is the malbush, and that the malbush is itself ain't safe, but it's a safe of ain't safe, and it allows the ain't safe to come to us in such a oifen that on the one hand we're experiencing the ain't safe, and the other hand we're able to experience it. Now, Rabbi say, I'm stopping now. I guess you could say that the bulk of today's class, which is well over an hour, was about Gan Eden, and that Gan Eden is ain't safe, and the kasha, how could a nivra be masa Gan Eden, which is ain't safe, and the teres, because the neshama has a lavush. The lavush itself is ain't safe, but it's ain't safe, which diminishes the ain't safe from its full potency, so that what the neshama should receive should be the ain't safe in a more diminished form. Now, I don't understand this myself. I didn't explain it to you, but this is what it says in Chassidus. So let's call this a class, and when I'm going to give my next class, I'm hoping to give my next class tomorrow morning. I'm sorry, it's now Motzei Shabbos. I started recording on Friday, it's now Motzei Shabbos. I'm hoping tomorrow morning to give a shir bli neder. So perhaps I'll find some oisias to explain a little bit what this means. This means that you have a garment which is ain't safe, which brings the ain't safe to you in a diminished form, and aspaklad yamida, which allows you to see directly, but allows you to see directly a light which has been a little bit diminished. Ukafish is by the common. Thank you for learning. Thank you for learning with us. So Mashiach kommen, soll rausgehen von Golos, sein bei allem freilich und gut und mutig, lichtig und lebendig von Herzen. There's two others, like the Rebbe spoke in Beis. This is Shishim Yoyim, which is the Simcha of Adam Batla called Varam Leitevim, Bari Mazle, Guf, Bari Neshama Bria, Chaim Yitzchem Beli Hefsek, Beteva Nirevan Nigle. Okay, so I started Friday and I'm finishing Motzei Shabbos. I guess I'll say a good Shabbos and a good Tavach.